The US has praised his killing in Yemen as a big triumph for its intelligence. But what does Anwar Al-Aulaqi's death mean for the thousands of angry Yemenis calling for a regime change? And will it help President Saleh as he clings to power? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Shakuntala Santharan. Wanted by both the United States and Yemen, Anwar Al-Aulaqi was accused of being an Al-Qaeda preacher and mentor. He was killed on Friday by a U.S. drone strike in the province of Al-Jof, north of the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. But will the death of the American-born cleric have much of an impact on the organization? Rory Challens has more.
So many legends surrounding.
For many, Anwar Al-Aulaqi was a paradox, an American citizen, Western educated and fluent in English, who rejected his own background in favor of the ideology of Al-Qaeda.
Don't consult with anybody in the killing of Americans. Fighting the devil doesn't require consultation or prayers seeking divine guidance. They are the party of the devils.
After studying civil engineering in the United States, Al-Aulaqi worked as a Muslim preacher and lecturer of religion in the late 1990s. He returned to Yemen in 2004, where his activities put him in contact with Islamist groups fighting the government in Sana'a. His sermons were widely distributed by those who supported the 2001 attacks on the United States. Major Nidal Hassan, who carried out the US Fort Hood Army-based killings in 2009, was just one of the hundreds he's thought to have influenced.
Yes, Nidal Hassan was one of my students, and I am proud of that. I am proud of Nidal Hassan, and this was a heroic and wonderful act.
Yemen has been fighting wars on many fronts, and its fragile government is hoping that Al-Aulaqi's death will roll back Al-Qaeda's hold on parts of the country.
I am sure that Al-Qaeda and their leaders will review their thinking and will realize that violence is not appropriate in a country that is pursuing democracy and political parties. They will get rid of violence and terrorism because there's no place in today's world for terrorism like this.
But the fear for many Yemenis is that the cleric's message won't die with him.
Today means also is a big hit and crash of the Al-Qaeda group in Yemen. However, that doesn't mean a lot, or that doesn't mean that the Al-Qaeda will be eradicated. It is a theology that needs to be fought. It is a theology that has to be contained.
The US has made several attempts on his life, including in May this year. This time, they succeeded. Rory Challens, Al Jazeera.
Well, for more on this, joining us are our three guests. From London, Shiraz Maher, a senior fellow at the International Centre for Study of Radicalisation at King's College London. From Washington, D.C., Christopher Swift, fellow at the Center for National Security Law at the University of Virginia. Christopher is also author of a soon-to-be-published book, The Vanguard: Local Insurgencies in the Global Jihad. And joining us on the line from the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, Hassan Al-Haifi, a political commentator and columnist. Welcome to Inside Story, gentlemen. If I could start with you, Shiraz. He's been dubbed the Bin Laden of the internet. How much power did Al-Aulaqi wield?
Well, I think it's quite difficult to quantify just how much of a following Awlaki had, particularly amongst the West. And I think that's where he really attracted a lot of attention. He was very charismatic. He was spent a lot of time in America and in the United Kingdom. And so he was very sort of aware of the cultural reference points for young Muslims growing up in these societies. And he was able to create a message that resonated with them in quite a deep and meaningful way. So, you know, we shouldn't be in any missed sort of illusions about just how charismatic Awlaki really was.
Christopher, what do you think? Was Awlaki as important to Al-Qaeda as the West seems to think? Was he a key operational figure or just a propagandist?
I would characterize him primarily as a propagandist. Remember that this is a chap that has a degree in civil engineering. He's not a theologian. although he took the mantle of one on himself later in life. I think it's also important to distinguish between the effectiveness Al-Aulaqi had in reaching out to westernized English-speaking Muslims and the effect that he had within Yemen itself. His death is a blow for al-Qaeda's propaganda operations, but in terms of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the reality on the ground in Yemen itself, his death is more symbolic than it is substantive. He wasn't involved in strategy, he wasn't involved in operations, he wasn't a trigger man, he was primarily a propagandist, and his audience was primarily Muslims in the West.
Hassan, what do you have to say? Ibrahim al-Asiri, a top al-Qaeda bomb maker in Yemen, I believe, is also said to have been killed in the strike. Yet all the attention has been on Awlaki's death. Why is that? Was his significance overblown because he was American, spoke English, and people in the West just knew his name better?
Well, as far as Yemen is concerned, and the political scene in Yemen, all these people really played a very, very minuscule role in the, in the ongoing events in Yemen, especially over the last couple of years.
So, differing opinions about the importance of Anwar al-Aulaqi to al-Qaeda, U.S. authorities have been sharing the news. President Barack Obama said that Awlaki's death is an important step in the American effort against al-Qaeda. He also had praise for Yemen's security forces.
The death of Al-Aulaqi marks another significant milestone in the broader effort to defeat al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Furthermore, this success is a tribute to our intelligence community and to the efforts of Yemen and its security forces, who have worked closely with the United States over the course of several years.
But Yemenis who've been protesting for months seem to have a different view. This is what some of them had to say.
Anwar al-Aulaqi doesn't concern us. It concerns the authorities, and it is a card they're playing for the West. Al-Qaeda is a bogeyman. It used to be Ali Abdullah Saleh's bogeyman, and now it is used by his son and nephew.
I think America is just telling Ali Abdullah Saleh that we do not need you to help us. We can target whoever we want, wherever we want. So don't provoke the international community.
This is a card being played by those who want to prove to America and the West that they are partners in the fight against al-Qaeda. It's just a tactic used by Ali Abdullah Saleh and those around him.
Shiraz, do you think the Saleh regime supplied intelligence to the U.S. to try and win American support? Was it an attempt at political survival?
I certainly think Saleh will be using this to his advantage. It's difficult to know beyond that just what the nature of the relationship is between Yemen and the United States. Of course, the United States has very good intelligence relationships with countries such as Yemen, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and of course within the broader Middle East. So Obama there clearly praised the intelligence community in America, and at the moment I think we're not really clear as to who pulled the trigger on Awlaki, whether it was the Yemenis, whether it was the Americans, and so in that context certainly it's great propaganda value for Saleh to use this to say to America, look, you couldn't have done this without me. But I think in line with what a lot of people were saying in the package we just saw and heard, to the average Yemeni, to the average person on the street, this doesn't really change anything. And Awlaki and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula doesn't figure so much on their radar. What they're worried about is removing the regime that they regard as corrupt and decadent.
Christopher, has the killing changed Washington's approach to what's going on in Yemen?
Well, the problem that Washington has right now is that its short-term imperatives are not well aligned with its long-term interests, and here's what I mean by that. In the near term, the United States' primary interest in Yemen is eliminating the leadership of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. They staged several attempted attacks on the United States. They've expressed an interest in doing more, and people like Al-Aulaqi were involved in deliberately inciting people in the United States to different forms and patterns of violence. So that's their short-term security imperative. But for the United States, their long-term interest in Yemen is a stable, somewhat pluralistic and legitimate government that's able to adequately address the aspirations of the Yemeni people. And to the extent that the United States continues to focus primarily on the short-term security, issues, it's going to be continuing to undermine its position relative towards encouraging a change in the Yemeni regime, reaching out to Yemeni society, and helping to find some sort of a new stable equilibrium. Interestingly enough, this is the same problem that many of the regimes in the Gulf Coordination Council also have, chiefly Saudi Arabia.
So, Christopher, are you saying that the U.S. isn't even interested in what's going on politically in Yemen?
Oh, they're extremely interested in what's going on politically in Yemen. The problem is you have two sets of priorities, right? The first is the near-term security imperative of dealing with AQAP, and the second is the long-term and much more difficult question of how to encourage the kinds of changes in Yemeni society that adequately represent the aspirations and the needs of the Yemeni people. Aligning those two things is very difficult because the instrumentalities involved are very different. There's also the question of, you know, what capabilities we have to bring to the table. The United States has the capabilities through Joint Special Operations Command and the CIA to put Predator drones in the sky and hit convoys with Hellfire missiles. We've done that in this instance. It's effective. But changing the political and social structure of a society as complicated and as convoluted as Yemen is something that's very hard to do by remote control. You can't change governments by remote control.
Back to you in Sana'a, Hassan. The timing of Awlaqi's killing was certainly very curious just after President Saleh made his surprise return to Yemen, and as he clings to power, how concerned are Yemenis that President Saleh could persuade the international community that he is indeed their man and that he could win support to help him stay in power?
Well, one can say for sure that the regime seems to be self-assured that their stature in the world has improved with the death or the announced death of Awlaki and his partner. We are even beginning to sense an increase in pressure from the security organs against activists in the revolution from this very day. As a matter of fact, as far as I know, at least 4 activists have been, attacked and assaulted. Others have been receiving threatening calls and stuff like that. So I think they have just over the last couple of days begun to really enjoy this victory. They call it a victory anyway, although they did not do it. It seems that the U.S. was the one who attacked, who hit Awlaki. But they seem to be assured that now they have a right of way to do whatever they can to put down this revolt that they are confronted now with for 8 months. And this is really worrisome. And we don't want to have this posture of the regime enhanced by something they did not even do, and which really has nothing to do with the Yemeni affairs per se, because these people did not influence affairs in Yemen at all. Of course, they may have been a danger to, other. The fact is that these people were even allowed to come. Who brought them in? It was the regime itself. So how can we, but now they are enjoying this as though it is, a signal for them to do whatever they like in Yemen. And this is what worries the protesters and the, people in the revolt.
Shiraz, so as Hassan was saying,
to build on that.
Go ahead, Shiraz.
I just want to make the point that, of course, we shouldn't attribute too much here to Saleh. Of course, America's shown quite clearly that when its security imperatives dictate, it is prepared to operate unilaterally. In the raid against bin Laden and his killing was a clear demonstration of that. That when America feels it has to act unilaterally in the preservation of its own interests, it will do that, and it did that with Pakistan. It would certainly have done that with Yemen had Saleh, or the authorities there not been cooperative. So, in essence, we shouldn't give too much credit here to Saleh, and in that sense, it's a great propaganda value for him on the ground. He's going to use this to sort of puff his chest to the world and say, "You need me," And Christopher is absolutely correct in what he was saying. I mean, the paradigm for America that the whole Arab Spring has presented at the moment is a very difficult one, a conflict of the urgent versus the necessary, and in that context right now, it's those imperatives are being pushed. And so for the Arab regimes that are trying to cling to power, they're saying, look, your urgent problems are getting a lot more urgent, and actually if we're not here, you're going to feel the tail end of this.
Yeah, if I can jump into that.
Go ahead.
If I can jump into that just a moment, that analysis is the distinction between the urgent and the important, or the urgent and the necessary, is exactly right, and it's the same tension that is not just that exists not just in terms of U.S. policy towards the Middle East and towards the social and political changes we're seeing with the Arab Spring, but it's also the same tension that Arab governments are dealing with within their own society. So insofar as these things can be brought into alignment, there's a lot of opportunity, but when they fall out of alignment, there's a lot of potential for violence, a lot of potential for misunderstanding, for a breakdown of these relationships, not just between the West and the Middle East, but also between rulers and the people within the Middle East itself. I also want to say that the fact that Saleh's government is using this event as an opportunity to sort of increase their crackdown on the protests and to consolidate power just shows how out of touch the Saleh government is with what's happening in everyday Yemenis' lives. This is not, the Al-Qaeda, in the Arabian Peninsula is not something that touches everyday Yemenis. The fact that 30% of Yemenis are unemployed, that 40% of Yemenis live under the United Nations poverty line, that the water tables are falling, and that 60% of the water that is available is used to cultivate narcotics. Those are the problems that affect everyday Yemenis, not Al-Qaeda.
And the corruption.
Hassan,
that's exactly
Hassan,
right.
go ahead.
Yeah.
The killing has certainly changed little in Yemen, hasn't it?
Excuse me?
The killing of Awlaki has changed very little, if anything at all, in Yemen. The crisis continues.
Just last week, the killing is going on. In Taiz now, every day the killings are going on with tanks and artillery and everything being used against the peaceful protesters. The killing hasn't stopped at all. In fact, it escalated somewhat even before Saleh returned to Yemen. We had this, last week, just before Saleh came. We had a big showdown with protesters in the electricity zone, what they call the electricity zone in Sana'a. No, the killing is going on, no problem with them about that. As a matter of fact, they are looking for ways to intensify it. And there are reports also that, the thugs, the non-official security forces are trying to penetrate through the square, trying to establish positions where they can either snipe at protesters or using their security organs to threaten protesters that they will be attacked. And as I said, today, this is unusual. This has stopped for some time. But now they're back to the same routine of security officials calling, activists whom they know are involved in the revolt, threatening them that, okay, you are number so-and-so in the arrest list, you will be arrested. Stuff like that, the security, they are still thinking that they can take care of this revolt with their own, with the use of force. And this is unfortunate, They are not learning anything. They didn't learn anything about the revolts in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, etc. The good thing is that really the protest, the people in the revolution have still clung to a peaceful revolution. They have not. They are not willing to be, intimidated to use any force, as the Libyans rushed into force. And look at the results. In Libya now you have over 50,000 people killed when in the space of so much, and they have a population of 6 million. We in Yemen understand that if we get into that kind of a situation, you can imagine with the Yemeni population so densely populated in one hub of the country, you can say, it will be a disaster. So the Yemeni revolutionists are still clinging to a peaceful revolt, and they will not be intimidated by any means, because we see this as being less costly. We have only, from the protesters themselves, we have about 300 or so casualties dead, and maybe about 2,000, 3,000 wounded. This is relatively much better, say, than in Libya. So that's why you will still see, and every Fridays and every millions still gather at the squares, because people are happy with this peaceful approach to a revolution.
Yes.
And we don't intend to be intimidated by the use of harsh force, no matter how they try. They want this so badly, but I think the people in the revolution are quite, what you call cultured in sticking to a peaceful approach. And we hope they continue that way, and we hope the regime and I think the regime will eventually collapse, because I don't think they can stand this.
Okay. Hassan, I'm gonna jump in. Shiraz, what do you think? Do you agree with Hassan? Is the regime going to eventually collapse? What's it going to take to remove President Saleh from power?
Well, it's very difficult to know. I've been following all the revolutions quite closely. We're seeing Syria, obviously, with ongoing daily protests as well. And it's very difficult to know how these things will play out. Each country's been so unique. And I think, again, in Yemen, it's sort of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. It's complicated by the fact that there is this Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has attracted so much attention in the West, particularly because it's been so potently focused against it, with plots such as Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, the cargo bomb plot, and Nidal Hassan, and so on. So the Awlaki factor and his removal could help shift the dynamics there somewhat. I mean, if you look several months back when the protests were starting in Yemen, Saleh was drawing forces, military forces, away from combating Al-Qaeda in regions of his country where there's no government control, and bringing them back to the capital to shore up his position. That, at the time, concerned the Americans quite a lot, because they felt their security interests were being compromised in order to prop up the regime of Saleh. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes forward, but I'm certainly not going to get in the game of making predictions. Each revolution, I think, is playing out very differently. But I think ultimately, once the people continue to protest and there's a head of steam, as there is in Yemen and there is in Syria, and these things maintain themselves and they keep going, it's hard to see for how much longer these regimes can hold on to power. But of course, it is the Middle East, and they are very experienced at crushing their people. So it's everything to play for.
I think there's an important point is, I think for the Yemenis themselves, if it wasn't for the foreign interference and for the foreign backing that the regime has been getting, really the regime would have been collapsed a long time ago. It is this foreign backing that is keeping the regime intact, and they have all the support they need. So that's why they keep going. But if we know as Yemenis, this has happened before in the past, we can come back together and reconcile our way and form a very peaceful, democratic, civil government. But with the foreign intervention, and I think this is the problem, that the Arabian Peninsula has been left to be a sphere of influence of Saudi Arabia, mainly, with the Saudi Arabian given, the go-ahead to opt for whatever they like in the peninsula, and surely they do not opt for any democratic, change in any country.
Christopher, I'm going to let you have last words here, because we're running out of time, gentlemen. How long do you think the Saleh regime can hold on to power? Do you agree with what Hassan and Shiraz were saying?
Well, there is one trend that is common throughout all of these revolutions in the Arab Spring, and that is they're occurring in countries that were Arab republics, where nationalism and sort of a tight oligarchy was the governing structure. To the extent that the military has supported that structure, those structures have stayed pretty much in line. They're stable, but they're also quite brittle. To the extent that the military has changed its mind, however, as we saw in Egypt and as we saw some factions do in Libya, these regimes have unraveled very, very quickly. The question is not just a question of stability, it's not just a question of change, it's also a question of legitimacy. To the extent that these governments can be seen to be legitimately representing the aspirations of their people, they're likely to hold on. To the extent that they're seen as being contrary to the aspirations of their people, I think you'll see social mobilization continue to erode the political structures that have been built up in these countries over the space of the last 5 decades.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I wish we could continue with our chat, but we're going to have to leave it there for now. In London, Shiraz Maher. In Washington, D.C., Christopher Swift. And on the line from Sana'a, Hassan Al-Haifi. And thank you very much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye.